Hey folks, it's Nate, and it's time I got back to the drawing board, and tonight we're going to look at Chapter 10 of Naoki Urasawa's Monster, one of my favorite manga of all time. And what we have here is a return to our leading man, Dr. Tenma. The last chapter set up the present-day life of Nina Fortnier, or more accurately, Anna Liebner, who was introduced as a young child in the beginning of the story, and who is now just coming into adulthood. She's attending college, she's about to turn 20, and her life is about to get infinitely more complicated, naturally. But the setup of this chapter is a return to Dr. Tenma, who is still interviewing the parents, foster parents, as it were, of Johann Lieberman, who he is hunting. And since all these parents are dead and they had no other children, he's just interviewing people in the neighborhood. And we open up on him interviewing this old lady here, who doesn't really have a whole lot useful to tell Tenma, but kind of recaps the investigation that Tenma is conducting for us. Undoubtedly, this was very useful when the manga was in its weekly publication. It's just sort of a speed bump in the collected version, which is, has its upsides and its downsides. There's basically 2 whole pages burned on recapping the investigation here, and this is a downside of a serialized story like most manga tend to be. It's kind of engaging. There are some interesting character quirks to this old lady, and all in all, it does its job. But I think the most important thing it does is it gives us a peek into Tenma as he is now. When we saw him in previous chapters, he was a much more affable person, and outside of the operating theater, he seemed kind of aimless. But in these pages, we see that he's become much more focused. He's not interested in chit-chat. He's not interested in eating anything that the restaurant has to offer. He just wants to find out what he can about Johann and his foster family and move along. This is a darker turn to his character. Tenma was a kind of a lighthearted person before. He bought the cuckoo clock for the lockpick that he operated on. He tended to stop and chit-chat with families, and he seemed to always be very good with kids when we saw him in the hospital hallways. So we are seeing a new side of him here, and that's a little something. It's good to see that. So these pages aren't a total loss, as it were, but story-wise, they don't really tell us a whole lot. In fact, unfortunately, this chapter is on the weaker side because Tenma simply investigates into Johann's past. The real interesting part is when he gets to Munich, and he's still asking about Johann's foster families, and the neighbor he talks to doesn't have anything to tell him. But he's called up by a man at a window, who we see right here. And this fellow is a veteran of the German Kriegsmarine in World War II, and he's gone blind, which Tenma doesn't know when he first sits down to talk to him. But there's some great visual storytelling in here. We kind of get an idea of his service record before he tells us anything, because Tenma looks around and he sees all these pictures. There's a cutaway during this discussion where we check in on Nina again, and there's, again, not a whole lot happens here. She chit-chats with her friends, and they talk about who could be sending her mysterious emails, because they've ascertained it isn't the boy in class that wants to ask her out. And they float some other possibilities that it could be. It sounds very interesting. It has some possibilities, as it were. There's a transfer student who it could be. Nobody knows a whole lot about him. And that's really all we get out of it. It does set up that Nina has a nice life at school, and she gets along well with other people. This sets some stakes, because when Johann appears, there's a very good chance that some or all of these people are going to die. Because that's what Johann does. He's not a very nice person. And that's interesting. But that's not the... yeah, we probably could have guessed that. I suppose taking, 3 pages? Yeah, 3 pages to set up this relationship does add some weight to upcoming events, but it feels kind of lackluster. And I suppose part of building suspense is giving us these, very happy-go-lucky conversations just to establish that these are normal, well-adjusted people who are about to face very dire circumstances. But I don't know. Maybe it's the time period. The dialogue is not very interesting. Maybe it's just, an older, middle-aged man trying to write a bunch of young, fresh-faced girls in this situation. Not Urasawa's greatest writing work. But we return to Tenma's conversation with this fellow here. I don't think this man is ever actually named. But we learn that he sat with Johann, or Franz as he was going at the time, taught him English and French, but mostly told him war stories, and talked about how his submarine was depth charged and barely managed to limp back to port. And, he says many young 12-year-old children would have considered that an adventure story. But what was so interesting to Franz, or Johann, was how people faced death. Terror amused him, as the old man says. And that's really all we get in this chapter. We get this look into who Franz was when he was younger. He was a boy who was very intelligent and interested in the world around him, but mostly he was interested in terrified people. And that kind of gives you a hint into what kind of person he was. Still is, in a very real sense. He's a person who feeds on terror, like the Sith. So he doesn't have a red lightsaber. That would be even worse. But yeah, one interesting insight that the old man has into Franz is that Franz doesn't really open up to anyone. Hasn't opened up to the old man. Hasn't opened up to Dr. Tenma. Only really opened up to his sister. And this discussion ends with the old man telling him that the sister is in Heidelberg, and that Johann intends to go and find him when she's 20, when they're both 20, since they're twins. And that's coming up very soon. So we end on a shot of Nina wishing her foster parents goodbye. Her foster parents haven't informed her yet that she isn't their biological child, and they've kind of intend to tell her that when she turns 20. But in the meantime, they're maintaining the status quo. So Nina goes to school. She's being introduced to this person that her friends were telling her about earlier in the chapter. And here we have an interesting subversion. As I said, Urasawa is a master of using the page turn to build suspense. And here we see Nina. She's on the stairs, and her friends are about to introduce her to this mysterious boy that they've been talking up, who recently came to his campus and has done a bunch of unexpected things and is good looking and kind of cute and apparently interested in Nina. And we get, the setup of the feet here as he walks up. And this is a classic Urasawa suspense panel where it ends on a moment right before something climactic is about to happen. And then on the next page, we actually see who it is, and it's not Johann. Look at this. He continues to set it up. We see his shoulder as he looks at Nina. Nina looks kind of surprised, and then it's Otto Huberman. It's not Johann at all, until we see just over his shoulder a mysterious figure in the background. And then we zoom in, and it is Johann. And I really like this kind of misdirection because it sets up a beat that you think is going to be a reveal. So you're ready, and you're like, who is it? Who is it? Oh, it's going to be Johann. Oh, it's going to be Johann. And then we get the flip, and we see your surprised expression because presumably Otto is a good-looking guy. And, there's the greeting, and it's not Johann. And then we see him over in the corner just beyond. And I think that's a really good misdirect. It does good things for suspense. It subverts our expectations just enough for us to be amused by this. And then once our guard is down, it hits us with the real reveal. It shows us Johan, and it hits us with that, oh, he is there. He is watching her. He is getting ready. But it's not time yet, so he hasn't closed the distance yet. But this is very portentous because, Nina, her comfortable life is beginning to brush up against the darker things of the world, because when she turns 20, it will be her time to face a monster. And in the meantime, she does have a little bit of breathing space. But we'll see what comes of that in chapter 11.